Hey, folks. Thank you so much for joining us on this warm evening in Newcastle. It's great to have you here for this final, at least in this series of Northern Data Debates. Thank you for the National Innovation Center for Data and the Alan Turing Institute for making it possible. And tonight's debate is going to be around the role of data science in sport. And sorry, I should say my name is Herb Kim. I recognize many of the faces here, but for those of you who don't know, I'm normally running various conferences like Thinking Digital and the recent TEDx Newcastle. And it's been my pleasure to have hosted this series of debates with Rachel and Angela. And so tonight, we have a really interesting panel here to discuss this topic. We have Paul Catterson, who was formerly an NHS consultant and for many years now has been part of the Newcastle United Football Club organization as the team doctor, among other things. So great, thank you for joining us. Sam Larner, who is a writer specializing particularly in rugby, if I remember correctly. That's right. Yeah. And Sam, where are you from?
From near Manchester.
Near Manchester. And are you there currently as well?
Currently there, yeah.
Okay, fabulous. Well, thank you for coming across the panel to join us. Yeah. Daniel Dinsdale, who is an AI scientist with Stats Perform. And Daniel, what is your area of specialty other than AI, I suppose?
I guess my background's in statistics, and I work primarily in football and cricket at Stats Perform.
Okay, and how did you get sucked into this world from the stats world?
Some potentially legal data fell off the internet onto my friend's computer, and it was sports data. And we analysed it, and we went to a conference and realised there was a world of sports analytics which we didn't know about. And then, luckily enough, when I was looking for a job, one popped up in the sports industry. So here I am.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for joining us. And you're coming up from London, right?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Okay, great. And is it Ree Galvin?
Yes.
Yeah, fantastic. So what's your first name in full?
Rihanna. So
Rihanna.
It is Welsh. It's not the Barbados name.
Also joins from St. Mary's University,
Yes.
where you are a lecturer in performance analysis.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I'm course leader of the undergraduate performance analysis degree at St. Mary's in Twickenham.
Fantastic, great. Well, it's been the final in this series, but to some extent, one that I've really anticipated the most. I think whenever this area gets discussed, I assume it's always the money ball of something, right? And if I'm sure most of you probably at least heard of the title, if not read the book or seen the movie. And it's fascinating. It's to some extent, to me, a representation of the potential of data science, which is to reveal patterns, arguably truths, that aren't apparent to normal human observation, if you will, and that and then have it put in action in a very high-profile way, and have it work. In the book, it was the Oakland A's, and if you haven't read the book or seen the movie, they are a team that is not in a major market, and hence they don't have tons of money to be able to chase the best players in the world. But they tap into data science, and please correct me if at some point I'm misspeaking here, to identify players who are underappreciated, and hence underpaid, and hence cheap, and they recruit them. They are, at various points, made fun of as they are going against the convention about how one recruits players onto a team, which often would rely on things like how good-looking their girlfriend was and their build and things like that as indicators of how good of a player they might be. And they would focus on less obvious things. If I remember correctly, it's not in the book, but that the Boston Red Sox then sort of largely took on this approach. And again, if you're not a Major League Baseball fan, the Boston Red Sox were notorious for not winning the World Series for many, many, many decades, and it was a point of great pain to Red Sox fans. And they've since gone on to win multiple World Series championships and are a big deal in baseball. They were a big deal in baseball, but they've become their results now match, I guess, their profile. So, anyways, to start with, each of the panels have got. Oh, sorry, we have a mystery person on Zoom, don't we? Should we reveal John Marco? Sorry, John Marco. Completely forgot. Ah. So, John Marco, you are up in Edinburgh. Is that right?
Yes.
Fantastic. Yes. Could you just tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, I'm senior lecturer in Science and Technology Studies, and I'm a faculty fellow at the Alan Turing Institute. And I'm developing research on the use of data science in football for a few years now.
Fabulous. Okay. Well, welcome, and thank you for joining us. And we've asked each of the panelists to start with just a few minutes of remarks. And John Marco, are you okay to kick us off since we've raised you from the internet?
Oh yes. So you want me to talk about the use of data science in sport? In my case, the area is football, obviously, and we have a corresponding founding father on the debate of use of data science in sport, which is not Moneyball directly, but this is this other book by Chris Anderson and David Sully that says number game, that why everything you know about football is wrong. And so there are these big claims and big expectations about the use of data science in football that have been around for at least 10 years now. In my research, I look especially at how football data analysts are trained, and to find out that there is a big difficulty there, because of course the real football man does not necessarily immediately like the idea of being trained in statistics or machine learning. So what we end up, having done like more than 100 hours of participant observation on training programs for football data analysts, what we end up training is statisticians or machine learning or data scientists, and incorporate them into the club setup. But there is an issue about how to be able to communicate the result of this like big data in a precise, concise, simple and short way, which is the way the football manager would like it.
Thank you, John. Ree, shall we move to you next, if that's okay?
Yeah, of course. I think for me, when I was asked to do this, I thought, oh gosh, I'm probably not an expert in data, but coming from the background that I do, being in an applied setting and being in and around it, and somewhat, hopefully, forming a few of the new data analysts that will be out there in the world through the course and the experiences that we can provide. And for me, it's funny you speak about Moneyball. That's the first lecture I do for the data analysis module, just to introduce the concept, and it works. And to explain, or maybe some people out there might not agree with the theories that have been used, and that's totally fine. Everyone has their own ways and measures of what does work and what doesn't work. But I mean, it's still being used at Brentford Football Club, so it can't be too bad. But students seem to enjoy that concept of something that's applicable to them. And there's a new film called Hustle with Adam Sandler in it, talk about basketball and scouting and recruiting, which is also an amazing film if you're interested in what they look at and the situational variables around sport and analysis and data, and putting into data into sport, but also extracting it in your own way and being able to tell your own story, I think is the most important part of data to me. I'm not a whiz at data, that's not my strongest point of being an analyst, but it's a part I enjoy, and I think that's also a really important part of it. So yeah.
Great. And I mean, you specialize particularly in hockey, right?
Yeah.
And are you seeing, so if you will, some of these big money sports, it's to some extent less surprising that they might be hiring, you know, people out of wherever to do this. But are you seeing evidence of the impact of data science in field hockey?
Sadly, in international field hockey, it's just us. So whoever or whatever country you are an analyst for, you are that workforce. In Wales, I'm the only one for the women's setup. We have one analyst for the men's setup. We have no equivalent to FIFA and Opta, who are collecting data right now for the World Cup. So we don't have that workforce to back us and to support us along the way. So we are trying our hardest to collect the data, and that's maybe why hockey isn't being influenced by data so much just yet, because we don't have the support and the workforce to collect the data behind us. So being a part-time analyst for Wales, there's so much I can do as a part-time analyst on the side alongside a full-time role as a lecturer. So data in field hockey is slowly growing, and we try as a group of international analysts to help one another, even through just a Dropbox. It seems to work, but for us it's a lot further behind than football and rugby for sure.
Daniel, do you want?
Yeah, so I think kind of following on that, my experience is quite different. So working in Stats Perform, Opta is our data collection. So we own the data that Opta collects. So first and foremost, I work for a data company. That's where the money is. That's the priority of business. But then on top of that, as a data scientist, I'm there to generate levels on top of the data, like predictions that we can send to clients, whether those clients are professional clubs or whether it's media. As a data scientist working in Stats Perform, it's less about the data. The data's not really a problem. We have a stack of it. It's more about what approaches do I take as a data scientist to ensure that the client, we meet the criteria of the client. So for media clients, it could be, I think Amazon Prime is an example. They bought a bunch of Premier League games recently, and we have our live win model that appears on the screen. So it tells you what's the probability of each team winning, what's the probability of a draw. As a team, when we're working on that model, we care primarily about it being reliable, not breaking, first and foremost, and being very quick so that once we receive the data, it gets there within a couple of seconds. But we also have to think very carefully about if we're working with a professional club, they probably don't care as much. If they're looking for a transfer target and they want to predict how well this player is going to perform at their club, they don't necessarily care if the model's snappy, but they want the predictions to be much more accurate. So we have to rethink from the data science team, from a statistical perspective, a completely different approach is probably what we need to do. So yeah, I think today that's kind of the perspective I'm coming at is going to be, I guess there's a lot of breadth, a lot of different sports, a lot of different areas that we have to think about when working in a data company like Stats Perform.
Thank you. Sam?
Yeah, so I guess from my perspective, I feel quite out of my depth on this panel because I'm not an expert in computer science or in data science, really. I'm I guess, originally a keen amateur who realised that in rugby there's quite a lot of data collected now, very little done with it even still, and that there was a way of using data to explain the game. So obviously Herb mentioned Moneyball at the start, so that was what got me into rugby, or what got me into baseball, sorry, and I realised that kind of tactical, statistical look might help get other people into rugby as well. So for me, what I do is I look at the data that gets produced and I build ways of looking at that data for people to really understand the game. So whereas in football there's this kind of shared lexicon where even if we're not football fans necessarily, we can watch the World Cup, we can talk about 4-4-2s, we can talk about inverted wingers, about false nines. There's that kind of shared lexicon because of perhaps things like FIFA or Football Manager. In rugby, we don't have that. So my dad, for example, has been involved in the game, playing and watching for over 50 years. There's a large chunk of the modern game of rugby that's kind of passed him by because it's not well explained. There's not a lot of websites out there that go into depth about this. And so for me, I had the reason just to try and explain it to him and to myself that became a bit more popular than that. And I think one thing that's really interesting from a wider perspective is that at the moment, the way I see it, and I interact a lot with people on Twitter, which obviously maybe not for much longer, but what you see on Twitter is that there's people who have this very paradoxical view of how science or analysis in sport works. Well, on the one hand, they think it's so accurate that there's no point in playing the game. You know, that everyone knows what's happening, we can just do a spreadsheet and everyone can sit at home and just enjoy it. And that players know exactly what the opposition are going to do, they know exactly what the next steps are. And then there's people who think it's all nonsense because there's no way that you can, the data that they see, there's no way that that could be useful. And often people believe both things at the same time. In reality, as with a lot of stuff, it's more nuanced and it's somewhere in between. In rugby, at least, we're still a long way behind. So the French leagues, for example, Lee talked about hockey, there being one person in the second division in France where teams would often cost 5-6 million euros to put together. There's also often just one analyst per team. So there's a huge amount of stuff that's not being done at the moment, and kind of the next steps, that's a really exciting bit.
Thank you. Paul?
Yeah, I suppose I've got a different viewpoint again. I was first came across data, I suppose, when I was an NHS emergency medicine consultant, and then morphed into my career in sports medicine, I suppose, at Newcastle United. We take a lot of data on our athletes, but it's trying to inform practice moving forward, really, both in terms of maximising what we've got and sort of keeping them going, really. I find that anyone can strap a GPS unit on somebody or take a video of a game, but actually the skill is actually interpreting the data, and it's finding those key people who are actually good at that. Because we make inferences from the data, and John Marker made a good point about how the coaches want the data presented, and we're constantly trying to evolve in that process, and that changes when our coaches change as well. Some of them want it very simply, and we'll use it to bash the athlete with. Some of them will want it in depth, and then want to sort of cajole the athlete with it as well. So it's used on a lot of different levels where I work, really. I remember even talking at a data conference, big data conference at Arsenal, it was 15 years ago, about the use of and what we're doing with the data, because there's so much information coming through, really, and how we actually filter it and use it practically on a daily basis. And we're constantly evolving the way that we do that. My main data that I look at personally is blood data, and GPS data, sleep data, strength data, and then trying to combine them all, almost trying to create a risk model, really, in terms of that. But I need a lot of experts around me to be able to help in that process. So yeah, quite a fascinating journey for myself, going from the NHS to working in elite sports medicine.
Okay, thank you. I mean, just continuing there. So my sense is that, at least in MLB, in Major League Baseball, that to not have an analytics team is almost kind of like, what the hell are you playing at, right? Now, but I don't get the sense the same is true. Not to divert this into America, but to make a point is that you see the same thing in, say, the NFL and the NBA, the NHL. That and then the reason I bring this up is part of the reason it worked in baseball so effectively. Is just because the amount of data that's been collected as part of almost the DNA of baseball is unusual, that you don't have the same intensity in rugby or field hockey or other sports, or you were talking about cricket before. Is that, I mean, is basically the quality of data collection in other sports as good?
I don't know. I think everyone's trying to get a competitive advantage, and I think that people who look outside the box and look at different sports and different industries, so the aviation industry, Formula One, just the way in which they interpret their own data, people are always looking for that competitive edge in my world, really, and are quite secretive about it. So they might look to the MLB, where purportedly they've been doing it for the longest period of time. But one of our major partners is that I work with is looking across a lot of the American sports really, and also partnering with the NBA on a league-wide basis, and the NHL, the Hockey League, because there are a lot of common themes across the athletes really, in terms of when we look at what we describe as their internal or their external load.
Okay. Well, I mean, this is a question for each of the panelists. Can you give an example where that you can? I realize some of this may be confidential, particularly in your case, Paul, but that the inclusion of data analysis, changed the decision that you might have made differently otherwise. And I mean, I guess what I'm really wondering, I mean, you I think kind of said that effectively the state of data analysis in hockey is still early doors, if you will, early days. And so, whereas I imagine at NUFC and at the Premier League, it's probably a fair degree further. I mean, you were talking before about football. Actually, at least the amount of investment that professional football is willing to make versus say cricket is substantial. So if we could, if you can talk about an example, and I'll ask the rest of the panel as well.
Yeah, I suppose I'll take it back a step really. With the data, you've got to ask yourself a specific question at the start. So I had a specific clinical question about an athlete at the start, and that's where my sort of data mining started really. Even this week, data changed. One of the processes that we take, or just before the World Cup break, we take data normally a day, 2 days after a game to see how fatigued the players are and to see if their performance is similar to how it was before the game or at the same point last week. So some of the strength data compared with some of their blood oxidative stress data was completely outside their normal range, because we like to have individual player ranges, was completely outside the normal range. It agreed with their subjective wellness scoring that they reported that day and what the coach was seeing on the pitch, and they were taken out of the following game basically. So that data trawling underpinned the decision making really across the different facets within the club.
Okay. John Marco.
Yes,
you still with us?
Yeah, I was thinking about expected goal as an example in football. So expected goal is a measure that provides every type of shot a certain percentage to turn into a goal, based on the position of the shot in the pitch, how close is to the goal, how much pressure it is expected in that part of the pitch, based on historical data of other shots taken from the same position. So expected goal is probably the most successful application of data science in football so far, and the way it affected clubs, and the way going back to your to the core part of your question, how does these affect the decision making? There has been a lot of jobs saved using expected goal, especially coaches, football coach, football manager, have been given a little bit more time, have been allowed a little bit more patience, because although the results were negative, the problem with football compared to other sports is that it's a low scoring sport. So you cannot really measure the performance based on result, because the majority of games end with 1-1, 2-1, 1-0 with those results, which does not tell the story of the difference in performance. So these underlying statistics that allow to produce a deeper understanding of or a more reliable understanding of performance actually saved a lot of coaches' job. Okay.
Interesting. Sam, should we anything in rugby that sticks out for you?
Yeah, so I think with rugby, one of the things that's becoming increasingly focused on is the recruitment. So obviously rugby players aren't paid as much as football players by quite a margin. However, the budgets in rugby are also much less than they are in football. So as a percentage, it's still giving a huge amount to a certain player. One of the things that's really not being looked at until recently has been looking at that player's data beyond the top level statistics that you can look on Wikipedia and see how many tries they've got. And to be honest, that was pretty much the extent of it. One of the things I do now is I will work with clubs and also sometimes with players to either get the players a job or help the clubs to find good players. And one of the things that is important to look at, and actually comes a little bit from expected goals, is one of the things I've been looking at is a stat called try equivalence. So if you imagine, I don't know how many of you are rugby fans, but if you imagine a game of rugby, you can have the ball gets kicked, you catch it on your 1 metre line, you run through everyone, you get tackled at the end on the 99 metre line, and you pass the ball to someone else who takes all the credit for that because they've scored the try. And that person who does all that running at the end of the season, when the kind of the top level stats are picked up, they've got nothing for that. So what try equivalence does is it gives them a credit for what they've done. So how far they've run, how many defenders they've beaten, how many line breaks they've got, plus the person who scores a try also gets a bonus for that. So if you are a club and you're looking at, for the player, if you want the player who scored 20 tries, that's going to be a big premium that you're paying for that person because a lot of clubs are looking and they want that same person. Whereas if you get the person who's got 20 try equivalents, or actually, I won't go into details, but it'll be more like 80 try equivalents, it'll be kind of 4 times, then that person likely will be going for a lot less than the person there, and you're going to be getting essentially the same kind of production. So that's one of the things where clubs are increasingly looking at alternative ways, and it really, I mean, a lot of this is going to go back to Moneyball, but it really goes back to Moneyball where they were looking at home runs, which is an easy thing to measure, it's in every newspaper, and they realised actually that alone isn't a great measure of a player's baseball ability. There's a lot of stuff behind that no one was looking at. You could get a player a lot cheaper based on those other things. So I think that would probably be one of the areas that I would choose.
Interesting, yeah. So I would have thought, I mean, it's kind of a little bit, I guess, like being a magician in the sense that once you've actually figured out your trick, you don't typically want to share it.
Yeah.
And
but I'm happy to.
in your case, but
yeah.
Interesting. Daniel.
Yeah, I guess all the points that have been raised, I think it's quite interesting because you talk about baseball being that first sport, which really blew up the analytics community. And I think in many ways, what we're talking about, all of these like expected goals, a lot of the things we're trying to do in rugby and football are really difficult because it's a team sport with loads of players on the pitch, and quantifying what makes a player good or a player bad can be really difficult. Like last night when England play, my absolute favourite player, Jordan Henderson, was lambasted by a lot of people fairly in some quarters, but the job he does for the team is very difficult to understand and quantify through analytics, even now. But in sports like baseball, it's still very difficult, but it's a one-on-one sport where you have a data point that's a pitcher and a batter, and we can see what happened. Now there's a lot more subtlety to it than that, but when you compare it to some sports where we're trying to really measure what makes a player good or what makes a player bad, it's much more difficult. And I think personally, I think seeing kind of cricket is catching up to baseball, and I think having worked a lot in cricket, there's a lot of room to grow still, but it's a much, I won't say easier problem, but it's a more restricted problem that allows you to create metrics and identify what makes a player good, what makes a player bad in a maybe an easier way than you can in other sports like football, where, like I said, it's very difficult to quantify and measure, but even though that's what we're trying to do. Cool.
Could we maybe turn John's sound off for the moment? One thing I wonder is in cricket, are they having to change the way they measure things in order? Because I would have thought, in response to all this desire to apply data science to sports, that some sports are like, well, we don't actually measure that much stuff. Are you seeing that, or?
Well, I think cricket is increased a lot the amount of influence you see from analytics. So I think a big example is with England. So the England cricket team is really, really big on data analytics, and the work that they do is that you can see is almost like, I'm trying to think of the example, but what they like to try and do is measure matchups. I think that's the big thing you see in cricket, where it's like, okay, we have a left-handed batter who's particularly strong in this area of the field. Mm-hmm. Can we, we need to identify ways to figure out who the best person to bowl the ball to them is going to be. And you see that with England cricket, where you have the cricket analyst there. He's sat at the edge of the pitch holding up signs, code words, and different things for the captain on the pitch to try and figure out, telling the captain, we've crunched the numbers based on our understanding of this match situation. Pick this bowler, or do this. So that's, I think, where you see in cricket going is a lot of things with matchups and things like that.
Okay, and Ree, the same question. And in your case, is that if things are still so early stage, what needs to change for it to become more relevant to what you study?
I think obviously it's so difficult to hear about where other sports are, but it's also so exciting to see where hockey can go. To the point of, I was fortunate enough to Commonwealth Games in the summer, but obviously we use data for team selection, especially once every 4 years for Wales, obviously every 2 years for England and GB. But team selection becomes such a big part, and that's where you end up in that multidisciplinary team and using those around you, so you have to have that team to use the data effectively. Instead of just going, as a team we did X number of passes, goals, shots, so on and so forth, we go, okay, what did we do in line with the fitness, in line with the meters per minute, what should we be doing, and what did we actually do? And we're fortunate enough to have that capability still. You might be thinking, you are using data, but not on the scale of other sports. So for us, it's just scaling up of how much we can collect and where we can store it, because we don't have these platforms to store it and the workforce to do, and it sounds bad, but the time, because there's not that much funding, we're then fighting that battle of workforce, and that's probably where AI is going to come into it all, but that's another kettle of fish. But at the moment, individual statistics is where it needs to go next for field hockey.
Okay. So, I mean, you talk about the future, and this is an interesting segue point. And I mean, one of the things, as we were sitting here thinking about, is that, I mean, you mentioned about AI and things like that. And it occurred to me that, I mean, as you look at how AI is going to disrupt multiple industries, not just in sports, there are certain professions, actually mostly white-collar ones, that appear to be under threat. Things like entry-level attorneys and things like that, where clearly computers and AI could potentially do the job far more quickly, far more accurately, far more cheaply. I was thinking is actually that the job of the head coach might actually be under threat in the sense of, if the state of data is good enough and it can, in the similar way the chess computer can analyze, gazillions of potential positions and scenarios and things like that, and be able to go through decades worth of data in similar situations. Will we see a future where the head coaches eliminate? I mean, certainly you would think you could see a future where the head coach's position is augmented by this kind of technology. Is it something where at some point you think, well, why don't we just go fully Skynet on Jurgen Klopp or whoever? And actually, I mean, because the argument, I mean, there's an interesting debate here, I think, between, because if you, and please don't get offended when I say this, but I mean, if you consider sports and entertainment, right, you wouldn't think about, well, how do we apply data science to movies? I'm sure someone is thinking about that, but it's not naturally something one applies to. And so, but I guess the temptation is that, well, if we apply data science or technology to sports, then we can get a competitive advantage over the next team, and hence it becomes a sort of arms race, if you will. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, you guys are closer to this than I am, but I mean, is that something that people are talking about how data science and technology will just change sports entirely, either inevitably or hopefully for the better? Any thoughts there?
Well, I guess fundamentally, the problem is that you have to put this data somewhere, and the place it gets put is in the head of a player. And if you think about rugby or football or hockey, or I guess any of the sports we talk about, but in this example, rugby, you've got a guy who gets a ball passed to them, has got a 20-stone, 6'9" South African who wants to take his head off, and he's got to then try and think back as to where the analyst has told the coach where the space is. And so there's stuff you can do. So a lot of analysis in rugby is less about let's dig into all the data and find out a little key bit of information. And it's more about let's put our team in a position where during the week we can train against what we think the opposition's going to do. So when it comes to Saturday, we have seen a lot of the what the cliche in rugby is the pictures that the opposition are going to show us. So they're going to show us 2 deep defenders when we're in this part of the pitch. So then when it comes to Saturday, you've seen that picture and you can then go and attack it. Now, obviously, the chess matches for 3 games before, you might show them a picture so that they then train for in the week that you then completely change on Saturday. But ultimately, there's a limit to what anyone can store in their head, and that limit is obviously shortened when you're under kind of a threat of physical harm. And so I think that's ultimately where it's going to hit a blocker. You know, I don't necessarily think that's the case in all applications. You know, if you've got more time, then there's probably a better use of that data. But in match, I think that's going to be the limit.
Yeah, well, I was thinking just about the use of, obviously, the increasing use of VAR and instant replay in all sports. And obviously, there was a ton of, I mean, for many, many years, it was resisted, whether it been tennis or football, currently, obviously. I mean, what's your sense is it feels to me like people are accepting it and actually generally prefer it, but I'm not an expert. I mean, any sense from the panel as to, and if we can make sure that John can chime in as well, if he wants to on this point sort of thing, so if you take that, so if we accept that VAR has been accepted, is successful, and is now a permanent part of the game. Well, then at some point, as technology advances, then you're just going to get rid of the refs, right? I mean, why? I mean, you know, these days to just confirm. Yep, the video shows that, and now you don't even need a video. You have the pane that shows the part that's gone through the pane, and they just look at that. And you know, many of us will know the state of computer vision is already past the capability of human vision, and so. Why not just go with a 100% reliable Skynet system, and then increasingly replaces other parts potentially? I mean, I've already mentioned the coach and things like that. I mean, but just before as we started, we want to make sure we give the time for the audience to ask questions. Any thoughts about what your sport or sport looks like in 10 years as you know, whether in hockey suddenly you're getting much better collection of data. Obviously, in your area, it's already made an impact both on how players are selected, but in your case, how players are being trained and healed. And John mentioned about expected goals and so on. So, where should we start? Who wants to go first? Who wants to take 10 years ahead in cricket? What are we looking at?
I think we're a long way off from my experience. I mean, to be honest, I've primarily worked in football, and you see articles or you see the news, and they're talking about these big machines that can basically do a data scientist job. That they can take all the data that we collect as a company and create the best expected goals model, better than what any data scientist can do. And I think having experience working in the industry and seeing what happens if you throw data into some of these models, I think we're a long way off. I think we're a lot further away than you might think. Mm-hmm. And that's because, depending on the problem, you might have, for example, the referee, for example. Your automated referee might be great 90% of the time, but it's that 10% of the time, or the 5% of the time, or even the 1% of the time where you need the human input. Whether it's quite a subjective challenge in the air in football, it's like, how is a computer going to figure that out? If it's an expected goals model, someone scores a goal kick, goes straight in the goal. It's seen 5 examples over the past 5 years worth of data. It doesn't have a clue what to do with it when it comes to predict what the probability of that goal kick being a goal was. So I think, yeah, we can be fine 95% of the time, but there's that human element that's needed for that last part to ensure that that the models we actually provide do the job that people want and ultimately are satisfied with. So hopefully.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, I was wondering to myself, is the human element just something we're clinging onto, and eventually it all goes
I think,
technological?
I think secretly, deep down, it's the part that everyone wants, the emotion. Because actually, at the end of the day, and certainly in my world, we're in an entertainment industry, and it's a multi-million-pound entertainment industry, essentially. And people don't want that black and white. Yes, he's right. They want something to shout at, something to disagree with, something to have a difference of opinion about. So I think the market will dictate, basically, it'll get to a point where the automation gets to, but then everyone will crave sort of human input and emotion, really, I think, which would be more difficult to input, really.
No, I think it's a very fair point. Yeah, just because we accepted VAR doesn't mean we're going to expect entire computerization of the entire game.
Yeah, no.
It's probably fair.
People love to agree and disagree with it, and then it stimulates more debate almost, and then stimulates more self-perpetuating news, really. So it's great. Everyone's a winner.
Okay, John, did you want to raise some
Yes.
point there? Sorry, Han.
I just wanted to follow up on your example of VAR and how and whether this is a good example of replacing human intervention. What happened actually is that VAR doubled the amount of referees refereeing the game. So we have now 4 referees in the pitch and 4 referees in the VAR room. So
Yeah.
it's in that specific example, which is an example everybody can understand. Artificial intelligence is providing more job opportunities for referees.
Fabulous. Well, I mean, while we have you, John, I mean, other than AI being a job creator in the referee industry, same question really, in terms of given what your work, how do you think things might be different in 10 years' time? What would you expect things to... and obviously, what do you think might just stay the same?
Yes, this is a difficult question to answer. So there are other examples of other applications of data science for in the area of transfer market, talent identification. So for example, Kevin De Bruyne became popular, end up on the newspaper for having sacked his agent and having negotiated the new contract with Manchester City using data analysts. So in that case, is the data replacing the agent? Few people mentioned that the reason for De Bruyne to sack his agent was not the preference for data science, but the fact that the agent had legal problems himself. So if it wasn't for the agent being prosecuted, probably De Bruyne would have stayed with his own agent. So this is an example of a parable where contingency that made De Bruyne decide to use data to negotiate his contract is made an example of a wider phenomenon, exactly the phenomenon of data science replacing the job of football agents.
Okay, interesting. Anything else before we move out to questions? Any other?
I'll just follow on a little bit.
Sure.
It's a good point, actually. I think I know of several examples in the NBA where they've used data for improved contract negotiations and direct comparison to other players in similar positions. And in America, I believe that the players own the data themselves and not the clubs necessarily. And I think that's going to change in this country as well. The bigger players in this country will start owning their own data, and they'll use that to force moves or increased contracts or different comparisons. So I think that's one of the spaces where it's going to change.
That is something that we're doing currently in rugby, is you're able to say whether someone's a top 5, top 10%, top 25%. And the great thing about data is if you're working for the player, you can pick the KPIs that you want to put them into that position. But from a club, obviously, you want to pick the KPIs that work best for you. However, that kind of using that data, you can make essentially using data to paint the story that you want, and that becomes quite compelling.
Interesting. Sorry, where did
Yeah,
you?
it's quite fun. Ended up on the topic of talking about will data be part of an agency's workflow. I had a call last week off an agency based in London asking for a student for an internship based off data to influence the decision making. These companies are out there looking for these students who actually want to tell a story and to help decisions through data and to try and make data fun, because there's that concept that data is quite overwhelming, it's quite scary. Yeah, I can back that up. When I went into university, it's probably quite overwhelming and you get quite scared by it. But in the next 10 years, the amount of students and young adults that will want to learn and will want to develop their skills in data is going to grow massively, because there will be those opportunities out there for them, which is so exciting.
Interesting. One thing I was wondering about is that, like, obviously we've gone from a period where the data nerds were ignored largely and made fun of, and now they're being lionized, right? There are obviously movies and books and things like that. Is there sort of a danger where people actually now shut off their brain and just wait for the data people to tell them what the right decision is? And as we know, I mean, just because you're a data scientist doesn't mean the answer you give is correct, right? Your data could be poor, your analysis could be poor, or just because no one's checking, you just kind of just say, you spout whatever you feel like. And I don't know if that's seen to be a problem as well.
I think I've come across a lot of rugby coaches who would love the data scientists to be wrong. They come from an era where any data, anything that's not a hunch is the devil, and so the data that's being produced until they retire is going to be completely ignored in those clubs, and yet they're still paying 2 or 3 analysts to do a job that the outcome of which is that there is none. So I think in 10 years, a lot of those guys will be retired, and the ones who come up maybe will be more interested in data, but there's still a lot of players who aren't that interested in it. I know a guy who's an analyst at a Welsh club, and a lot of they say afterwards, we've got kind of essentially office hours where you can come and you can ask us for specific stuff that would help your game, and he says 3 out of the squad of maybe 40 will come to him regularly for that. So I don't think that's unusual. I think that's fairly common across the clubs, and probably across the sports as well.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I mean, ultimately, if these players are certainly finding themselves at the bottom of the barrel, they might start to change their tune. Yeah. And I did think, again, while we were sitting here, that as particularly augmented reality improves, where at some stage it'll be embedded into a contact lens per se, let's say, so it's not some big dorky glasses, that you could see a situation where players are literally fed suggestions or commands generated by computing, not by someone yelling into their contact lens. and it's something I'm sure that's almost inevitably going to happen, right? I would have thought. And undoubtedly there's going to be a ton of resistance initially from that until you start getting beat. And then you kind of think, well, I guess, computer says kick left. And so, and of course you'll be analyzed by your compliance to the commands as well. So anyways, who knows where all this is going to go, but it certainly paints an interesting picture. Well, before we get to the audience, is there some way that data science could get rid of FIFA? Is there some way that we could have it undermine robots or cyborgs? Sorry, I was going to ask why does FIFA have, but that's a whole other debate. So we have some new microphones, don't we? Where did Angela go? Is she on a cigarette break?
I'm here.
There she is. Oh, fantastic, yeah. If we have any questions from the audience,
Okay, so in keeping with a sporty theme, we've got a catch ball.
Oh, wow. Fantastic.
I'm not sure what to do with this.
Rant away.
So my question relates to the point you made about getting a competitive advantage, and therefore your answer might shape the rest of my fantasy Premier League season. But there's now 10 million people playing it, so it's a lot of people's access to data analytics in sport. And I suppose you've got your choice of your players and you base things on the fixtures they've got, their underlying stats, how many goals, assists they've got, etc. But at what point do you continue to persevere with somebody, and I guess translate into professional sports as well? Do managers continue to persevere with players who are posting excellent underlying stats but basically aren't performing on the pitch? Or is there a point where they will fall back to the eye test because the stats just, you know, they're great, but they're not doing it on the pitch? If that makes sense?
I think that could be where the element of humans always being involved is going to be. Because if we do just follow the numbers, then what you say won't happen, right? You're just going to stick with the player, even if the underlying numbers are good, but they're not performing. We do need that human element to try and, you know, understand what is worth sticking with, what's worth, like, you know, is it stick or twist with this player? And a lot of the time, you know, all these predictions have inherent issues. Like, all of the models, no matter how good they are, there might be an underlying problem. It could be a player who's not performing. Maybe they just don't fit into the team. Maybe they're just unhappy with where they live, or something like that the model can't read. So, you know, that there always needs to be that element of the models. This, like we've said before, a suggestion. There's an element of uncertainty in what goes into the model. There's an element of uncertainty in what comes out of the model. So we need the human to make that decision on whether they're happy to, you know, for Fantasy Premier League, are we happy sticking with a player who's not performed this season but's performed in previous seasons? Does that make us happier to stick with them, or do you want to take a risk with a young player who might potentially be better? We've not seen enough data to support that. It's that sort of balance you've got to make. It's quite subjective balance still.
A member of staff actually got sacked from a Premier League football club for deselecting a player from their own fantasy team within the club, and because they knew they weren't going to play that weekend because they were injured. So you've got to be careful which leagues you go into as well.
Interesting insider information.
Yeah.
There. Yeah. Sorry, John, did you? I don't know if you raised your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that there are certain positions for football, at least, that are easy to read using data. So if you are a goalkeeper, a striker, or a midfielder that touches the ball a lot of times, then the data about the data clubs have are, you know, telling about the performance. But there are other, because historically the most common data so far has been ball events. So there is a certain tagging that goes on behind the scene that capture data about what the ball is doing, where the ball goes. There is new forms of data, tracking data, that will resolve the situation, but so far. So defensive performance is very difficult to understand from the data, because the defender move in correspondence to what the other players of the team do. And so they do a lot without the ball. So it's mainly playing without the ball. So the eye test, going back to the question from the audience, the eye test is still best for many reasons, but especially there are areas of positions, certain positions that cannot be understood by data at all.
Thank you. I think we had. Can we actually take three, just so that we give everyone a chance, and we'll allow the panel to pick and choose.
Thank you. My name's Tom. Some people in here will know me as a marketer, but I try and be a sports coach outside of work as well. The discussion naturally and interestingly has focused very much on the elite level. But I'm mindful of Ree's point around, you know, the challenge in some other sports, and, you know, that's got me thinking about, if you like, the community level game. And I'm curious whether you think the data and the analysis at the elite level is pulling away from what is available in the community game, or through things like VO and the AI interpretation of games, are we actually closing the gap between the community level and the elite level?
Down here.
Right. somewhat of a similar question to what you sort of mentioned. But just for context, my academic research pertains to sort of performance evaluation in football and game state evaluation in football. And one of the things that sort of popped up in the research was the sort of differences and the inequalities in the quality of data and sort of who had access to that, right? So you had sort of, as you mentioned, sort of ball events data and sort of static data. And then you had sort of dynamic spatio-temporal data, which is not available to everyone. So I suppose my question is, as sort of data science progresses and data collection progresses, is the sort of narrative of Moneyball that smaller teams can sort of overcome the odds and because of sort of their better sort of data analysis, can they sort of win matches that they don't? Given the fact that now it's going to be a function of how sort of how much sort of resources you're going to have, and that sort of determines how much quality you've got in your data. So I suppose that's my question. If that makes any sense. Yeah.
Okay.
So my question is slightly different from all the ones that I've gone before. I'm very interested in femtech and companies like Wild AI, who are using AI to help with analysing the difference of performance with young women as they go through puberty, but also as they go through their various menstrual cycles throughout the month. So can the panel kind of foresee how that might, I don't know, open up a bit of a bigger sector within the industry of sports analysis with AI? For both younger people kind of going through changes in their body to women that have to deal with that for the rest of their lives, I guess. So.
Do those three? And then we've got one.
Okay, great. Right, yeah. So we had a question about the impact of data science on amateur sports, whether or not it's opening the gap or helping close it. I struggled a little bit to understand the femtech question. So could you just repeat that for us?
So femtech, technology that is there to help women.
Okay.
Basically with their health kind of issues. But Wild AI is a company that's using the data of women's bodies to help with the training as they are
Okay.
in various sports. But it's becoming more of a thing because training programs have been
Sure.
developed based on male performance.
Of course, yeah.
Women's performance. So,
Yeah.
but I guess the same could be said for younger people going through puberty. That whole cycle of life must surely be affecting performance at some level, be it for the better or for the worse. But certainly for women going through their menstrual cycles, completely changes how they perform.
Okay. So to some extent, the as data science becomes better and collects a broader set of data, will it allow for, if you will, more specific training and other things for different populations, whether it be by gender or by age or?
Yeah, but it's really important for women in sports because girls drop out of sports once their periods start.
Mm-hmm.
And so the whole thing of puberty for girls is much more important when it comes to sports. So helping them to understand it and that tweaking their training programs might actually be a way of keeping them
Sure.
in sports.
Okay.
We have talked to you.
Yeah, I'll go straight into that one if you want. So I think it's fairly well evidenced now about menstrual cycle and hormonal changes affecting, so what I look at is injury reduction, is ligament laxity. And there are a lot of, well, not a lot, but there's some high profile women's teams who are using menstrual tracking to change their training weeks and profiles really. Because they know that at certain times a month it's going to be more risky basically to have those injuries. And it's possibly one of the reasons among many that, for example, cruciate ligament injuries are more common in female sport. But I think it has to come, actually, it's already at the elite level. I think it's quite a simple thing to do as well, really. And we look at it from an injury reduction point of view, really, and how they manage the training load over that week or month, really. So it's really important.
I just think it's a great career opportunity for women, for girls to be interested in science and technology and AI, but also in sports as well.
Yeah, yeah. No, there's quite a few female sports experts now in there, really, in companies taking it on very positively.
And I think just off the back of that, there's an organisation called Women in Sport, and they've recently done research that only 7 in 10 girls don't participate in sport when it is their menstrual cycle. And why? What can they do to encourage some sort of light form of exercise at a younger age? And we'll get on to the other question around grassroots level, which is probably, not being biased, the most important part of sport, just because of the development. They can't be eating microwave meals. They can't be wearing the wrong kit. In St Mary's University, one of our lecturers, Kat, has just done some research into how kit can affect performance and development of girls. And so to speak, if they're wearing a boy's football boot, the ankle can become, over time, formed in a different way, so they kick the ball in a wrong way. If their shorts are too tight because they're boy shorts, they won't be able to, so on and so forth. So this information needs to be collected, but across the nation and not just in one small space, so we can then influence later down the lines of why are they being injured. Can we pick it up from the grassroots level? So it is that element of what is being collected, where is it being collected, and who's storing it, and who can help each other along the way for us to, as a nation, to overcome that small issue of making sure everyone will participate. And then hopefully longer down the line, if they stay in sport, we'll have more role models. So it's that constant battle and that cycle. But I think in terms of the grassroots one, for example, in Welsh hockey, obviously that's still an international standard. We go to under 13s at international, but we do provide performance analysis of the same KPIs from under 13s to senior women. But we just casually add a few more based off what the coaches prefer. So it's trying to implement that in a way of coach developing, so all the coaches have the same skill set to be able to implement into their team. So it's doing those little elements where the under 13s, they might not know what, 25 entry is from the left-hand side. They might be thinking, oh, I just hit it into the circle, so to speak. But it's having that exposure to it. The earlier they are, the better. And if you're at international, you take it out, that's phenomenal. If they can appreciate a skill that they've done from a video and appreciating what a KPI is at the age of 13, I think we're doing something right. And that is the start of it. We don't have to go deep into data straight away. It's appreciating a few steps backwards to then when they get to 16, they're doing the GCSE maths. Yeah, they'll be doing algebra. Might not happen in clean and data, but it's an element in the start to it of the development of little ones. Does that answer ish?
Yeah, in a form, absolutely, yeah.
I can maybe touch on the Moneyball question about how that would change. So I think one of the things I think back to is Team Sky or Ineos, who hung out, the cycling team. So their big focus was on marginal gains. They would bring their own mattresses to races to sleep on. They would bring washing machines in their team bus so they could wash their kit. They would do all these little marginal gains, which is Clive Woodward in 2003 when England won. He said, let's do 100 things 1% better rather than one thing 100% better. So there's a lot of talk about those things and how you can kind of Moneyball. The problem is England had the best team in 2003 and Ineos had £60 million a year to spend. The reason they were winning was not because they had a mattress, that helped. It was because they had a huge amount of money and they could buy the best rider and then the second best rider and then the third best rider and merge them together and win a lot of races. So I think what will happen is the Moneyball example it's instructive actually if you look into it, because while it's true that they won with a lot less money, they also won because they drafted the best pitching talent that was available to them at the time and available to the league. And that's one of the things that's not really touched on in the book is that there's a lot of talk about batters and how they got these batters who were slightly fat guys who failed elsewhere and they brought them in. But actually they had the 3 best pitchers in Major League Baseball and they'd done well to pick them up in the draft system, but that was kind of what it was built on. It was built on that fundamental. And the issue is, and maybe Newcastle will find this with their new owners, is that you can throw a lot of money at something and you can make mistakes and still be successful. Where there's where Forest Green might beat Man United in the FA Cup at some point, but they're not going to do it consistently because they just, over the longer periods, a longer data set, those variations which can lead to one match successful, they disappear.
In Formula One, is it generally speaking the truth that the teams with the most money tend to win?
Believe so, yeah. I'm not an expert, but I believe it's pretty much a linear kind of.
And is that just simply? I mean, in addition, obviously, being hired better drivers, and it seems there's a fair amount of technology that goes into creating the best cars, and it sounds potentially like you'll fall into the same arms race with regards to the application of technology and data science to sport, where people hire the best analysts and can collect the best data, and are potentially more likely to you can see players being attracted because they know that X team actually has the best data science team around. Like, we're running out of time, so before I know we had a couple more questions. Angela?
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Hello. It was probably more a question directed to Paul, which was that, again, when you look at the success that has been achieved by Eddie Howe at Newcastle United, and some of the phenomenal achievements of the players who've gone from a certain point to a certain point, what percentage of that is down to data versus the other side, which is the EQ, the emotional intelligence that exists within, which appears to exist within there. So there's obviously a lot of science and a lot of very good work that's going on there, but how much of it then goes back to some of those softer factors or those social skills that complement the application of data?
Yeah, and I think most of it's the softer skills, to be perfectly honest, because a lot of the data was going on before and after, really, as well. I think some of it's been due to certain player acquisition, but I think a lot of it has to go down to the manager and the culture. There's quite a few studies out now regarding culture and communication within organisations, and if they're successful, then it makes it adds to the greater good, really. So I would say that 90% of it's probably that emotional quota that you've mentioned, really. That ability to manage and get the best out of individuals, really. And a lot of it is I find that where I work, a lot of it is about how you talk to people and the information that you actually pass across and the information that you don't pass across sometimes, to actually get the best out of those individuals at the right moment. So yeah, a lot of it's the emotional side.
Thank you. Angela, do you want to? I think we've got, you could fling it across if you like.
That'd be good for them.
Anybody else?
Yeah, we've got one here, and I think, was that it then?
Thanks. We've talked a lot about sort of data and stuff, but what about the ethical side? For example, I think somebody mentioned gathering sleep data, which isn't necessarily data generated during times of employment. So you've got that side of personal data, whether it's too intrusive or not. And then from an AI side, you've got gathering data from your own club, or do you use AI to gather data from other people by using video replays to sort of capture data that way? So the question is there any sort of ethical framework around capturing data in this sort of area? And I think the other question, which has possibly been answered, is how will you measure whether data science has made a real improvement to performance compared to the other elements?
Okay. And we had one more question here. If we just...
Thank you. I think everyone here has an interest in the intersection between data and sport, but if you're not currently working in the industry, a lot of the data is proprietary or private. So I don't know if any of you had any recommendations of how to sort of overcome that hurdle, given the main recommendation usually if you're not working in an industry is to do projects of your own to show your interest. And that's, so if anyone had any advice on how to overcome that, then it'd be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Overcoming proprietary data and ethical concerns about data collection. Anyone want to?
I guess maybe I can give something on both points, because at least I don't know too much about the rights and owning of data, but at least to some degree I'm aware of say, tracking data that is collected from optical tracking cameras within stadiums. That's often, like, for example, owned within the league. So the Bundesliga, I think, is an example where if you wanted to buy a player from the Bundesliga in Germany and you're like, okay, this player looks good, you can't really use the tracking data that's collected. But I do not, as far as I'm aware, believe there's anything to stop you from using computer vision from television footage to identify. It might not be as accurate, but I know it's a very big area where you can now film any game. You could film a game at the park and technically have data on those players. So yeah, I think going forward, that's going to be a very big thing. But I think at this point in time, a lot of the data is very carefully controlled in terms of when it's collected from leagues, from confederations, for example, FIFA doing a lot of this tracking data during the World Cup. But when it comes from things like television, I think it's pretty much, you know, it's kind of like open to people just taking that, using computer vision. And then in terms of accessing that sort of data, it's, yeah, I mean, yeah, I wish it was much easier. It's something, there's ways, there are often, I don't know if that sounds bad, there are opportunities. So kind of like, I mean, with the company I work for at Opta, we have this conference that we do every year, the Opta Forum, and that happens in March, I think, next year. So like now, as of today, if you go and look at that conference and check the application page, you can email and get a sample of event data or even tracking data, like the newest tracking data, which I even haven't had a chance to look at yet. So I would say things like that are good opportunities. A lot of the conferences, the big data companies like to give out data to let people show what they can do, because it's a great recruiting tool as well, right? Like, it's a great way to see, if you just let the public have access to a few games of data, they can do, you know, a lot and potentially get a foot in the door at some of these companies. So at least from what I've seen, that's probably the best way of getting data in a legal way, in a safe way.
I think just off the back of that, obviously coming from an educational point of view, there are websites obviously out there like FBref, Y-Scout, Opta. Sometimes obviously there are annual fees which are really irritating. Even from an educational point of view, if we're doing a data module, we want to be able to provide data. But there are organisations, for example, if you email Volleyball England, they will point you in the right direction. And it's sometimes stepping out of the comfort zone to reach out to people and to organisations. Find an email from the analyst from the England netball team and say, hi, do you have data sets from 10 years ago? And be like, is it in Excel form? Perfect. Away you go. People are willing these days, and obviously if you say nothing that's too personal, which obviously links into the ethical point, that there is no framework that I know of, and I'm in the education sector, and obviously we have to follow protocols closely, but there are some websites. But reach out, step outside your comfort zone and just put yourself out there, because again, I don't want to use the word, but it's networking, but it's the best way to do it.
I probably on the second question there, so I know Danny mentioned it earlier, same thing for me, where my first data set, you know, fell off the back of the lolly and I was able to go and use that. I think one of the things, so I work with Oval, who produce rugby data. One of the things they're trying to do is get more data out there into the hands of people who, similar to what happened in baseball, where a huge amount of the baseball analysis staff are people who really should be solving bigger problems in the world, but instead you're looking at baseball. And Oval are wanting to do something similar for rugby, really, where they can put this data out in there to the really intelligent people who can then do something with it. So hopefully there's going to be more opportunities. I think to an extent, there's still plenty of opportunities to be a generalist and be really good at it. But one thing that might be worth looking into is focusing on one particular area where you can capture the data really easily. So it might be something like, you know, corners. It might be something from a particular league where no one else is interested in or currently focused on. It might just be that you look at a completely different sport where the data is far less easily or far less, I guess, controlled or expensive. And that can then give you a way in elsewhere, because I completely agree, for a long period of me looking at it, it was data I was getting from analysts who probably shouldn't have been giving it me, and and data that I was kind of collecting myself. And if you're able to do that, it then opens the door to get the data legitimately, which is a nicer feeling.
All right. John or Paul, any final points before we close here?
I'll let John go.
John?
I don't know where to start. There were a lot of interesting questions. So very, very quickly, on the community elite question, so there is a kind of legal action going on, raised by more than 800 professional players against the use of their event and tracking data by over 150 companies. So the lower you go into the tier of football, the less advantage the individual football player takes from data. So they don't even know that someone is using their data to for transfer market or talent identification. So that's a big issue. There are smart technologies. So for example, an Italian company is launching a new smart shin pad, which can bring some benefit of artificial intelligence at a lower cost to community football. So this is an interesting trend. And in terms of, if it's big money or small money that can benefit from artificial intelligence, there were the early success cases were like Bolton, when Sam Allardyce was the coach in the early 2000s. And this was one of the first use case of, okay, we are using data in football. And the other is Brentford, that has been around as a case study. But more recently, increasingly, it's the big teams like Manchester City hiring astrophysicists to run their data science unit. So it's a contested issue whether data science goes well with small club or big club. You need a lot of capacity, a lot of resource to interpret data. There is the big question about gender and data, which I don't have the time to answer, but it's a very urgent question as well.
John Marco Campagnolo from University of Edinburgh, Ree Garvin from St. Mary's University, Daniel Dinsmore from Stats Perform, Sam Larner, independent writer from Manchester, and Paul Canterson from Newcastle United. Thank you all so much. Can we have a round of applause for our panel, please? Thanks. If you'd like to stick around, there are still some refreshments outside, snacks and drinks. And thank you so much for coming. Any final announcements that we need to? Yeah, really appreciate everyone turning out and for the questions. Good night, everyone. Thank you.